Beyond the wall, where the wind cuts like a blade and the night never truly ends, there once stood a ranger whose name was whispered in fear and reverence. A man who survived what should have killed him, who lost half his hand but became twice the warrior, who faced an impossible choice between life and honor and chose something far more difficult. The Frostfangs, 299. After conquest, a legendary ranger stands before his student, knowing that in moments one of them will die. But this death is not what it seems. This is not defeat. This is the beginning of something greater, a sacrifice so profound that it would change the fate of the Seven Kingdoms forever. His name was Qhorin, Halfhand. And tonight you will discover why the greatest victory sometimes looks like surrender, why the deepest loyalty sometimes demands betrayal, and how one man's final act would save thousands of lives he would never see. But before we begin this journey into the frozen north, into the heart of the Night's Watch and the mind of its greatest ranger, I need to ask you something. Right now, 84% of you watching are not subscribed. If you find value in these deep dives into the legends of Westeros, if these stories help you drift into sleep or simply transport you to another world, please hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing but means everything to this channel's growth. Also, drop a comment below. Tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. I genuinely love seeing our community span from King's Landing to the real world, from dawn watchers to midnight listeners. Your comments remind me why I craft these tales. Now, settle in, dim the lights, pull up that blanket. Maybe let a fan hum softly in the background. Tonight we walk beyond the wall, where legends are born and heroes die forgotten. This is the complete story of Qhorin Halfhand, the ranger who understood that some battles are won not by surviving, but by choosing the right way to fall. Let us begin at the wall itself, that ancient barrier of ice stretching across the northern reaches of Westeros. More specifically, at the Shadow Tower, the westernmost manned castle of the Night's Watch, where our story truly takes root. It is the late 290s after conquest. Robert Baratheon sits the Iron Throne in distant King's Landing. But here, politics mean nothing. Here, at the edge of civilization, the Night's Watch maintains its eternal vigil against the darkness beyond. And at the Shadow Tower, there serves a man who has become something more than human in the eyes of his brothers, a living legend. His name is Qhorin. But no one calls him that anymore. To every ranger, every steward, every brother in black from Eastwatch to the Shadow Tower, he is simply the Halfhand. Imagine him, as he appears to his brothers, tall as a spear, with shrewd gray eyes that have seen things most men only hear about in nightmare tales. His face is all hard, flat plains, clean-shaven when most rangers grow beards against the cold. His gray hair, long and heavy, pulled back in a warrior's braid that falls past his shoulders. He wears the black of the Night's Watch, though years beyond the wall have faded it to gray, as if the land itself has claimed him, made him part of its frozen tapestry. He carries a long sword, wears mail and helm like any ranger, but it is his right hand that draws every eye, that defines him, that gave him his name. Where 5 fingers should be, only 2 remain. The thumb and forefinger, nothing more. The other 3, gone, lost to a wildling's axe in a moment that should have ended with his skull split open. Qhorin serves as second in command to Sir Dennis Mallister at the Shadow Tower, but his true position cannot be measured by rank alone. He is what every ranger aspires to be, and fears they never will. A living legend in the Night's Watch, one of their very best, perhaps the best. He speaks quietly, deliberately, weighing each word as a man might weigh gold, but those who have seen him fight know another Qhorin entirely. In battle, he moves with savage speed, with a violence that seems impossible from such a measured man. The injury that should have crippled him has somehow made him deadlier. Beyond the wall, among the free folk, his name carries different weight. The wildlings hate him, fear him, respect him. Mothers tell their children, if you are not good, the Halfhand will get you. He is their monster, their cautionary tale, the shadow that haunts their camps and hunts their warriors. Yet, unlike so many of his brothers, Qhorin does not see the wildlings as mere enemies. He understands them, respects their bravery, their strength, their cunning. This makes him more dangerous, not less. He knows how they think, how they fight, how they survive. He has walked their lands longer than most of them have lived. But how did this legend come to be? What forged the Halfhand in the frozen crucible beyond the wall? To understand his end, we must first understand his beginning. And that story starts with friendship, loss, and the day everything changed. To understand the man Qhorin became, we must first understand what he lost, not just his fingers, though that loss defined him. No, what truly shaped the Halfhand was the breaking of a friendship that once seemed unbreakable. His name was Mance Rayder, and once, long before he became the king beyond the wall, he wore the black cloak of the Night's Watch. He and Qhorin were brothers in more than just oath. They ranged together, fought together, survived the impossible together. Two young rangers learning the brutal lessons that the lands beyond the wall teach to those foolish enough or brave enough to venture into them. Mance was talented. There was no denying that. Quick with a blade, quicker with his mind. He could charm wildlings and brothers alike with equal ease, but there was always something restless in him, something that chafed against the rigid discipline the Watch demanded. He questioned orders, he pushed boundaries, he wanted to understand why, not just obey. Qhorin saw it, recognized the signs. Mance had never truly learned how to bend, how to submit his will to something larger than himself. The Watch is not kind to men who think themselves wiser than their commanders, who believe their individual judgment should override collective duty. And Mance, for all his gifts, could never accept that the strength of the Watch lay not in brilliant individuals but in unified purpose. The breaking point came over something seemingly trivial. A cloak. Mance had torn his regulation black cloak, and a wildling woman mended it with bright red silk, the only material she had. When his commanders ordered him to remove it, to maintain the uniformity that keeps the Watch strong, Mance refused, not because of the cloak itself, but because of what that order represented. Someone else deciding for him, someone else controlling even this small aspect of his life. He deserted, left his vows behind like a snake shedding skin, crossed over to the free folk, and never looked back. For Qhorin, this was not just the loss of a friend, it was a betrayal of everything sacred. The Night's Watch had kept its vigil for thousands of years because men honored their oaths even when those oaths demanded sacrifice, even when they hurt. Mance's desertion was not freedom. It was weakness disguised as strength. Yet despite this wound, despite the betrayal, Qhorin never spoke of Mance with simple hatred. He understood the wildlings better than most brothers because Mance had taught him to see them clearly. They were brave, strong, clever, quick, in many ways as capable as any ranger. Their flaw was not cowardice, but the opposite. Each believed himself as good as a king, as wise as a maester. They had no discipline, no ability to sacrifice individual desire for collective survival. Mance was the perfect embodiment of that philosophy. He had traded the strength of unity for the illusion of freedom, and now he gathered the free folk under his banner, becoming what he had always secretly believed himself to be: special, chosen, a king. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before Mance's betrayal, before the breaking of that friendship, there came the moment that gave Qhorin his name, the moment that should have killed him, but instead forged him into something harder than steel. The details are sparse, as most legends are. What we know is this. A ranging gone wrong. A wildling warrior with an axe. A split second where death came screaming toward Qhorin's skull. Most men would have dodged, rolled away, accepted the wound to their body rather than their sword hand. But Qhorin was not most men. In that fraction of a heartbeat, he made a choice that defied every instinct of self-preservation. He caught the axe, not with a shield, not with his blade, with his bare right hand. The axe bit deep, 3 fingers, severed nearly clean. The middle finger, the ring finger, the smallest finger, gone in an instant of white-hot agony. The wildling must have thought victory was his. A ranger with a maimed hand is a dead ranger. He was wrong. Qhorin, blood pouring from his ruined hand, did not fall, did not scream, did not retreat. Instead, he thrust that mangled hand directly into his attacker's face. Blood and torn flesh and exposed bone shoved into the wildling's eyes, blinding him with gore. And while the man reeled, unable to see, unable to comprehend what kind of madman would weaponize his own mutilation, Qhorin killed him. Quick, efficient, without mercy. The other wildlings who witnessed this did not stay to fight. They ran, and the story spread. The ranger who caught an axe with his hand and turned his wound into a weapon, the man who should have died, but refused to accept that verdict. The aftermath was almost worse than the injury itself. The pain that came later, once the shock wore off. The infection that nearly took his entire hand, then his arm, then his life. The fevered dreams where he wandered through endless white wastes, pursued by shadows that whispered he should have died, should have let the axe take him. But Qhorin survived. He always survived. When the infection finally broke, when he could stand again without collapsing, he looked at his ruined hand and made another choice. He could accept a posting at Castle Black, take a role that did not require a sword hand, live out his years in relative safety, honored for his service, respected for his sacrifice. Instead, he picked up his sword with his left hand and began to train, hour after hour, day after day, week after week, learning to grip the hilt with unfamiliar fingers, learning to compensate for the missing weight on his right side, learning to turn what should have been a crippling weakness into something else entirely. The brothers watched him with mixture of pity and awe. Pity because they believed he was denying reality, clinging to a past that was gone. Awe because his determination never wavered, not even when he could barely lift the blade, not even when every movement sent fresh agony through his damaged hand. Months passed, then a year, then 2, and slowly, impossibly, Qhorin became as deadly with his left hand as he had ever been with his right. More deadly, perhaps, because he had learned something in that crucible of pain and persistence. He had learned that the body is merely a tool, that will matters more than strength, that a man who refuses to quit is more dangerous than a man with all his fingers intact. The name came naturally, Halfhand, not as an insult, though some tried to use it that way at first, but as a title, a mark of respect. The ranger with half a hand who was worth 10 whole men. Since that day, the wildlings beyond the wall knew no foe more implacable, no hunter more relentless, no enemy more dangerous. Qhorin Halfhand had become exactly what the Night's Watch needed, a legend wrapped in black, a reminder that the watch does not break, does not bend, does not surrender, no matter what the cost. But the loss of his fingers, as defining as that moment was, pales in comparison to what came next. The event that would cement Qhorin's reputation not just as a skilled ranger, but as something almost supernatural, a man who had looked into the face of certain death and walked away laughing. It began with a ranging during the last winter before Jon Snow was born. Not just any ranging, but a deep penetration into the Frostfangs, that mountain range beyond the wall where even wildlings fear to tread when the snows come. Qhorin led his small group through the Skirling Pass, gathering intelligence, tracking wildling movements, doing what rangers do. Then the weather turned. Anyone who has never experienced a true northern winter cannot comprehend what that means. This was not a snowstorm, not a cold snap. This was the kind of weather that kills everything it touches, the kind that makes the air itself feel like knives in your lungs, where exposed skin freezes in minutes and frostbite claims fingers and toes and noses with casual cruelty. The snow came so fast and so thick that visibility dropped to arm's length. The wind howled like a living thing, furious and hungry. The temperature plummeted until even breathing became an act of will. And Qhorin found himself cut off from his men, separated in the white chaos, alone in the Skirling Pass, with winter closing around him like a fist. The smart move would have been to hunker down, find shelter, wait for a break in the weather. But there was no shelter. Not in those mountains, not in that storm, and the weather did not break. Not that day, not that week, not that month. Winter had come early, and it had come to stay. Qhorin was trapped. The passes were impassable, buried under snow taller than a man. The routes back to the wall were death sentences, winding through terrain where one wrong step meant a fall that would not end until bones shattered on rocks far below. Even if he somehow navigated those paths, he would freeze long before reaching safety. So he did the only thing he could. He survived. No supplies beyond what he carried. No support, no fellow rangers to share the watch or the warmth. Just one man alone in the most hostile environment on the continent, with winter settling in for its long stay. The details of those months are unknown. Qhorin never spoke of them in detail, and the few times he referenced that winter, his words were sparse. But we can imagine, we can piece together what it must have taken. He would have needed shelter, so he must have found caves or built lean-tos from whatever materials the mountains provided. He would have needed fire, nearly impossible in those conditions, yet somehow he managed it. Perhaps he found veins of coal in the mountain rock. Perhaps he learned to coax flame from wet wood through sheer stubborn will. Food would have been the greatest challenge. Game disappears in deep winter. Birds fly south. Deer and elk move to lower ground. Even rabbits burrow deep and stay hidden. But Qhorin had spent years learning the land, learning where animals shelter, where they feed, where they can be found even when they should be nowhere. He set snares with freezing fingers. He tracked through snow that covered his tracks as fast as he made them. He ate things no southern lord would recognize as food. And always, constantly, every moment of every day, he had to stay warm. Had to keep moving enough to maintain body heat, but not so much that he sweated, because sweat in that cold is death. Had to dry his clothes by fire when they got wet, which they always did. Had to check his extremities for frostbite, knowing that his already maimed right hand was especially vulnerable. The psychological toll may have been worse than the physical. Humans are not meant for such isolation. We are pack animals, social creatures who need connection and conversation and the presence of others. Months alone, hearing nothing but wind and his own thoughts, speaking to no one, seeing no friendly face. Many men would have gone mad, would have started talking to themselves, hallucinating companions, losing grip on what was real. Qhorin did not break. His mind, like his body, was tempered steel. He endured because endurance was all that remained, because the alternative was death, and death would have to take him by force. He was not going to surrender to it. There were close calls, certainly. Nights when the cold was so intense that sleep felt like dying. Moments when hunger made him weak and dizzy, and prone to mistakes that could be fatal. Times when he must have wondered if anyone even remembered he was out here, if anyone was looking, if his death would even be noticed. But winter, for all its fury, eventually exhausts itself. The snows lessened, the temperatures rose just enough, the passes began to clear, inch by grudging inch, and when spring finally came, when the first thaw turned solid ice back to running water, Qhorin walked out of those mountains. He was thinner, harder. His eyes had seen things that left marks no mirror could show, but he was alive. Against every odd, against every reasonable expectation, he had survived an entire winter beyond the wall, alone, with nothing but his skill and his will. When he returned to the Shadow Tower, the brothers thought they were seeing a ghost. Men trapped beyond the wall in winter do not come back. That is simply understood. The cold takes them, or the wildlings find them weakened, or they starve, or they fall. They do not walk back through the gates, months later, as if they had simply been on an extended ranging. But Qhorin did. The story spread through the watch like wildfire. The Halfhand had done the impossible. He had survived what kills everyone else. He had looked at the worst the North could offer and refused to die. From that point forward, when Qhorin spoke about the lands beyond the wall, about survival, about what it takes to endure, every ranger listened. He had earned authority that no rank could grant. He knew every mountain pass, every hidden valley, every cave and stream and defensive position in those frozen wastes. He knew because he had lived there, alone for months. He knew because the land itself had tried to kill him and failed. The Halfhand was no longer just a ranger. He was a legend, and legends, as everyone knows, are dangerous things, especially when they are hunting you. With his reputation secured by survival, that bordered on the mythical, Qhorin settled into his role at the Shadow Tower, with the quiet authority of a man who had nothing left to prove. The Shadow Tower itself sits at the western end of the wall, far from the relative civilization of Castle Black, even farther from the occasional visitors and southern politics that touch Eastwatch by the sea. It is a lonely posting, a hard posting. The men stationed there are the ones who understand that glory is a southern concept, that the real work of the watch happens in silence and shadow, far from songs and stories. They defend the Bridge of Skulls, watch the western approaches, and monitor the Milkwater and the Gorge. They are the tip of the spear that points into wildling territory, and they know it. Sir Denys Mallister commanded the Shadow Tower. Then an aging knight with more honor than sense, beloved by his men, despite his advancing years. But everyone understood the reality. When decisions needed to be made about rangings, about tactics, about how to deal with the wildling threat, it was Qhorin they looked to. Sir Denys had the title, Qhorin had the knowledge. He spent more time beyond the wall than behind it. Weeks would pass, sometimes months, with Qhorin and his hand-picked rangers ranging deep into wildling territory, not raiding, not looking for glory, simply watching, learning, gathering the intelligence that kept the watch one step ahead of their enemies. And he had gathered around himself a group of rangers who matched his skill, each one exceptional in their own right. They became his eyes and ears, his weapons, his brothers in the truest sense. There was Dalbridge, a master archer whose skill with a bow bordered on supernatural. In his youth, he had squired for a king, though which king and what circumstances brought him to the wall remained mysteries he never discussed. He could put an arrow through a wildling's eye at 200 paces. More importantly, he could hold a position alone, raining death on approaching enemies, buying time for others to escape. A valuable skill beyond the wall, where retreat is often the only option between survival and death. Then Eben, a hard man even by the standards of the watch. He rarely smiled, rarely spoke unless speech served a purpose. But he was loyal to Qhorin with the intensity of a hound to its master, and his particular talents made him invaluable. Eben knew how to make people talk, not through charm or persuasion, but through methods the watch officially frowned upon, but privately acknowledged as necessary. When they captured a wildling and needed information quickly, Eben got that information, always. And Stone Snake, the smallest of the group, but perhaps the most uniquely skilled, he could climb sheer rock faces that looked impossible, finding handholds where none seemed to exist. Send him up a cliff and he would return with a map of enemy positions, troop movements, weaknesses in their defenses. He moved through vertical terrain like other men walked on flat ground. These were Qhorin's chosen, not the strongest rangers, not the most famous, but each brought something essential to the table. Each filled a role that made the group more than the sum of its parts. Dalbridge for ranged combat and defense, Arben for intelligence gathering and unwavering loyalty, Stone Snake for reconnaissance in impossible terrain. Together, they formed something approaching a special unit. While the bulk of the watch held castles and manned the wall, Qhorin and his rangers went hunting. They tracked wildling movements. They identified leaders and assessed threats. They eliminated problems before those problems became large enough to require full military responses. The philosophy Qhorin brought to this work was simple, but profound. Unlike many in the Watch who saw wildlings as subhuman savages to be despised and destroyed, Qhorin understood them, respected them, even. He had learned this partly from Mance, back when they were brothers. The free folk were not cowards. They were not weak. They were as brave as any ranger, as strong, as quick, as clever. In single combat, a wildling warrior could match any brother of the Watch. Their flaw was not individual capability, but collective organization. They had no discipline. That was their weakness. Each wildling thought himself as good as a king, as wise as a maester. They refused to bow to authority. They had not personally chosen. They could not maintain complex military formations or sustained campaigns. They excelled at raids, at individual heroism, at small unit tactics, but they could not build the kind of unified force that made the Night's Watch, vastly outnumbered though it was, still capable of holding the wall. Qhorin taught his rangers to use this against them, to exploit their lack of coordination, to turn their individual bravery into a tactical disadvantage. A wildling warrior would stand and fight when he should run, would seek personal glory when he should seek survival, would trust his own judgment over collective wisdom. Understanding this made Qhorin more dangerous than 10 rangers who simply hated wildlings and wanted them dead. Hate is easy. Understanding takes work, but understanding wins wars. He also taught his men that the Watcher's mission was not extermination but defense. The wall was not there to kill every free folk north of it. The wall was there to protect the realms of men from what lay beyond. The wildlings were part of that equation, yes, but they were also in their own way fellow victims of the true threat that lurked in the far north, the others, the White Walkers of legend. Most rangers dismiss such talk as superstition, but Qhorin had spent too much time beyond the wall to be so certain. He had seen things, heard things, felt the wrongness that sometimes pervaded certain places where the wind blew from the north and the shadows seemed too dark. He did not speak of these things often, but they informed his decisions nonetheless. As the years passed and Qhorin's ranging became more frequent and more successful, his reputation grew not just within the Watch, but among the wildlings themselves. They told their children about him, used his name to frighten the disobedient. The Halfhand became their boogeyman, the shadow that stalked them, the ranger who always seemed to know where they would be before they knew themselves. This fear was not unearned. Qhorin's deep knowledge of the terrain, combined with his understanding of wildling tactics, made him nearly prescient. He could predict where raiding parties would cross, which valleys they would use, where they would camp, and he would be there, waiting, with Dalbridge's arrows and Eben's blade and Stonesnake's intelligence. But it was more than tactical genius. It was dedication. The kind of dedication that comes from understanding that your life belongs not to yourself, but to the vow you swore. Qhorin had worn black for so long it had faded to gray, as if the color itself was being leached away by his time beyond the wall. He was becoming something other than fully human, a creature of ice and duty and endless vigilance. And he was about to need every bit of that dedication, because far to the north, in the frozen wastes, something was stirring. The wildlings were moving, not raiding, not the usual scattered camps and small groups. They were gathering, uniting, and that could only mean one thing. Mance Rayder was coming. The year was 298. After conquest, though those beyond the wall marked time differently, by winters survived rather than years counted. Lord Commander Jorah Mormont, the Old Bear as his men called him, had grown increasingly troubled by reports filtering back from ranging parties, villages abandoned, wildling camps empty, entire clans vanishing into the northern wastes as if swallowed by the wind itself. Something was happening, something unprecedented. The Night's Watch had faced wildling threats before. Raids were common. Small incursions expected. But this felt different. The pattern suggested coordination, planning, the kind of large-scale movement that only happened when someone united the fractious free folk under a single banner. Benjen Stark, first Ranger of the Night's Watch and brother to Lord Eddard Stark of Winterfell, had gone ranging to investigate these movements. He never returned. His absence gnawed at Mormont like an open wound. You do not lose your first ranger without consequence, without questions that demand answers. So Mormont made a decision that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier, when the Watch still had the numbers to defend every castle on the wall. He would lead a great ranging himself. 300 men, nearly every able-bodied ranger the Watch could muster, marching beyond the wall in force, not to raid, not to punish, but to discover the truth about what was gathering in the northern darkness. Word went out to every manned castle. Castle Black would provide the bulk of the force, but the Shadow Tower would send its contribution as well, and command of that contribution fell naturally to the man best suited for the task. Qhorin Halfhand would lead 100 rangers from the Shadow Tower to rendezvous with Mormont at the Fist of the First Men, that ancient ring fort built by the First Men thousands of years ago. It was a journey of weeks through hostile territory, and every man who volunteered knew the odds of returning were poor at best. They marched anyway, because that is what rangers do. The journey north from the Shadow Tower took Qhorin and his men through familiar territory at first, then gradually into regions where even experienced rangers trod carefully. The land beyond the wall is not empty. Despite what southern lords believe, it is watched, always watched. Wildling scouts perch on ridges and hide in tree lines, observing, reporting back to their clans about Night's Watch movements. Qhorin knew this, counted on it. In fact, let the wildlings see them coming. Let them report a large force of rangers moving east. It would draw attention away from the main body under Mormont, give the Old Bear more time to position his forces undetected. But Qhorin also knew that some intelligence was worth fighting for, worth bleeding for. And when his outriders reported a wildling scouting party ahead, a large one led by a raider the free folk called Alfin Crowkiller, Qhorin made the tactical decision to engage. The battle was sharp and vicious. Alfin Crowkiller had not earned his name through cowardice. He fought with the fury of a man who knew every brother he killed was one less blade the Watch could put on the wall. His warriors matched that intensity, meeting the rangers with axes and spears, and the desperate courage of people defending what they saw as their homeland. But courage alone does not win battles. Discipline does, training does, and Qhorin's rangers had both in abundance. They moved as a unit, each man protecting his brother's flank, advancing in formation while the wildlings fought as individuals, brave individuals, skilled individuals, but individuals nonetheless. The wildlings broke, scattered into the hills and vanished like smoke. But the victory came at cost. 4 rangers dead, a dozen wounded, some badly enough that they would need to be sent back to the Shadow Tower rather than continue to the rendezvous. More importantly, Qhorin had captured a prisoner. The man was defiant at first, spitting curses and calling down every dark god on the rangers who held him. But Eben had ways of encouraging cooperation, and eventually the wildling started talking. What he said changed everything. Mance Rayder was in the Frostfangs, not just passing through, not just hiding. He was searching for something old, something powerful, magic that could bring down the wall itself. The prisoner did not know what specifically Mance sought. The king beyond the wall kept his own counsel on such matters, but every wildling clan for 100 leagues knew the broad strokes. Mance was uniting the free folk, not for a simple raid or even a large-scale attack. He was preparing for war, total war. The kind that would either end with the wall broken and the north overrun, or with the free folk destroyed utterly. Qhorin questioned the man extensively, extracting every detail he could. Numbers clans involved, routes they were using, timelines. By the time he was finished, he had a picture of the threat that was both clearer and more terrifying than he had imagined. He also had a decision to make. This intelligence needed to reach Mormont immediately. The Great Ranging had been planned on the assumption of finding scattered wildling bands, perhaps a few thousand free folk at most. But if this prisoner spoke true, if Mance had truly united the clans, they could be facing an army of tens of thousands. The Night's Watch numbered barely 1,000 men across all its castles, and 300 of them were about to march straight into a trap. When Qhorin finally reached the Fist of the First Men with his remaining rangers, he found Mormont's forces already there, establishing a defensive perimeter around the ancient stone crown that topped the hill. The Fist was a strong position, its earthen ramparts still visible after millennia, offering clear sightlines in all directions. Mormont called his senior rangers together for a council. Qhorin laid out what he had learned. The room grew quiet as the implications sank in. 300 against thousands, in enemy territory, with winter approaching. Some counseled immediate retreat, get back to the wall while they still could, abandon the ranging, and prepare for a siege. But Mormont was not called the Old Bear for nothing. Retreat without intelligence would leave them blind. They needed to know what Mance was looking for in the Frostfangs. Needed to understand his plan, needed actionable intelligence that could help them survive what was coming. Qhorin proposed a compromise. 3 scouting parties, small groups that could move fast and quiet, send them into the mountains on different routes. 1 might get caught, 2 might get caught, but odds were good that at least 1 party would survive long enough to learn something useful and get that knowledge back to the main force. It was risky. It meant splitting their strength. It meant sending men into certain danger with uncertain odds of survival. But it was also exactly the kind of calculated risk the Watch was built for. Sometimes you sacrifice the few to save the many. Sometimes you walk into darkness hoping your brothers can see by the light of your funeral pyre. Mormont agreed. 3 parties, 3 directions, and Qhorin volunteered to lead one personally. He would take his usual crew, the rangers who knew him and trusted him. Dalbridge, Eben, Stone Snake, men who could move through the mountains like ghosts. But there was one more addition to his party. An unexpected one, and it came from an unusual source. Jon Snow, Lord Commander Mormont's personal steward, stepped forward and asked to join Qhorin's ranging. Jon Snow was young, too young by most standards to be considered for arranging into the Frostfangs during a crisis of this magnitude. He had been with the Watch for barely a year, still wet behind the ears in the eyes of veterans like Qhorin, who had spent decades beyond the wall. But there was something about the boy that caught Qhorin's attention, something beyond his obvious connection to House Stark, though that was significant in itself. Ned Stark had been a friend, or as close to a friend as a ranger could have, among the Southern lords. Good men often raised good sons, even bastard sons. No, it was more than lineage. Jon Snow had killed a White, one of the walking dead that should not exist, but did. He had faced that abomination in the Lord Commander's quarters and put it down with fire when blades proved useless. That took nerve. More importantly, it took the ability to think clearly when confronted with something that defied everything you thought you knew about the world. Mormont did not want to send his steward into danger. He made that clear. Jon was not a ranger, had not earned his blacks in that capacity. He was useful where he was, helping the old bear manage the logistics and politics of commanding a force this size in hostile territory. Jon's response was simple, but effective. No one else in this council had killed a White. He had. That experience, limited though it was, gave him knowledge the others lacked, and knowledge about the enemy. Any enemy was worth more than gold. Mormont countered that Jon had also gotten himself beaten by Craster, that half-mad wildling who kept his daughter wives and offered hospitality to the Watch only because it served his interests. A ranger needed better judgment than to provoke a man on his own ground. Before Jon could respond, Qhorin spoke up. His voice carried the quiet authority of a man who rarely needed to raise it. He defended the boy, not effusively, not with grand speeches, just a simple statement that sometimes courage matters more than experience. That Jon had asked to go because he wanted to be useful, not because he sought glory. That was the right instinct. The room shifted. When Qhorin Halfhand vouched for someone, people listened. Samwell Tarly, Jon's closest friend in the Watch, offered to take over Jon's duties as steward, free him up to range. It was all the excuse Mormont needed. He agreed. Jon would ride with Qhorin. As the council broke up and the rangers dispersed to prepare their gear and provisions, Qhorin took a moment to study his newest recruit. Jon Snow stood taller than average, with a stark look about him, long face, dark hair, gray eyes that held a seriousness unusual in one so young. He carried a bastard sword which was fitting given his birth, and at his side padded a dire wolf. The wolf was what truly interested Qhorin. Ghost, Jon called him. An albino beast with red eyes and fur white as fresh snow, silent as death itself. Direwolves had been extinct south of the wall for generations, yet here was one bonded to a boy who would ride into the most dangerous mountains on the continent. Magic, that is what it was. The old magic that still pulsed through the land when you got far enough from the courts and castles of the south. Jon Snow might not understand it yet, might not even recognize what he had, but Qhorin did. The boy and the wolf were connected in ways that went beyond pet and master. They were pack, family, two parts of one whole. That could be useful, or it could be a liability if the boy proved unable to control the animal in a crisis. Only time would tell. The ranging party assembled in the gray light before dawn. 5 rangers where Qhorin would normally take 3 or 4. Jon made them more visible, more vulnerable to detection, but Qhorin had made his choice, and he stood by it. Sometimes you had to trust your instincts about people. Sometimes you had to give the young a chance to prove themselves or condemn themselves. They moved out quietly, leaving the relative safety of the fist behind. The goal was the Skirling Pass, a route through the Frostfangs that wildlings used to move deeper into the mountains. If Mance was searching for something in that region, his people would be using that pass. Qhorin's group would scout it, observe, gather intelligence without engaging unless absolutely necessary. The first days of travel passed without incident. They moved carefully, using terrain to mask their approach. Ghost ranged ahead, his white fur making him nearly invisible against the snow and rock. Several times the direwolf's behavior warned them of wildling scouts in the area. They avoided contact by taking longer routes or waiting hours for patrols to pass. Qhorin used the time to observe Jon, how he handled himself in the wild, how he responded to orders, how he managed fatigue and cold, and the constant low-level fear that came with ranging deep in enemy territory. The boy proved competent, more than competent. He did not complain, did not question orders, did not try to prove himself through bravado or unnecessary risks. He simply did the work, kept his gear maintained, stood his watches, followed Dalbridge's lead on the climb, and Stone Snake's advice on rockcraft. But it was in the quiet moments, when they rested or made cold camp, that Qhorin truly began to understand what he had in this recruit. Jon asked questions, good questions, not about tactics or fighting technique, but about the free folk, what drove them, why they lived beyond the wall, what they wanted. These were not the questions of a man who saw wildlings as subhuman enemies to be exterminated. These were the questions of someone trying to understand, trying to see the world through their eyes. Exactly the kind of thinking that made Qhorin himself effective. During one such conversation, Qhorin spoke about Mance, about their friendship before the desertion. He told Jon that Mance was the best of them and the worst of them, that only fools like Thorin Smallwood despised the wildlings simply for being wildlings. They were brave, strong, quick, clever, but they had no discipline. They thought themselves free, and everyone believed himself as good as a king and wiser than a maester. Mance had been the same, never learned how to obey, never accepted that the strength of the Watch came from unity, not individual brilliance. Jon listened to this with an intensity that suggested he understood the deeper lesson, that the Watch survived, not because it had the best fighters or the smartest commanders, but because every man was willing to submit his personal desires to the collective good. That was the difference between the Watch and the Free Folk. That was why 7,000 years of wildling attacks had never broken through. As they pushed deeper into the Skirling Pass, Qhorin found himself thinking that perhaps bringing Jon Snow had been the right choice after all. The boy had potential, raw and untested. Yes, but potential nonetheless. He had no idea just how critical that potential would become. How soon Jon Snow would face a test that would define the rest of his life. How a choice made in these frozen mountains would ripple out to affect the fate of kingdoms. The wildlings found them on the 5th day. They had been moving through a section of the pass where sheer cliffs rose on either side, channeling them along a narrow path of broken rock and ice. Good defensively, but also limiting their options if they needed to scatter. Qhorin did not like it, but the alternative routes would have added days to their journey, and time was a resource they could not afford to waste. Ghost sensed them first. The direwolf's ears pricked forward, his head turning toward a rise of tumbled boulders about 200 paces ahead. He did not growl, did not make any sound, but his entire body tensed in that way animals do when they detect threat. Jon saw it immediately and signaled to the others. The rangers melted into whatever cover the terrain offered. Qhorin hand signed instructions. Stone Snake and Jon would circle wide, come at the wildling position from an unexpected angle. The rest would hold and wait for the attack. It took them half an hour to get into position, crawling over sharp rock that cut through their gloves, moving with such patience that a watching bird would have grown bored. But eventually they were there, positioned above and behind 3 wildlings who crouched near a small fire, warming their hands and discussing something in voices too low to hear clearly. The attack was over in seconds. Stonesnake and John came down from above, while Qhorin and the others closed from the front. 2 wildlings died before they could draw weapons. The third, a woman, threw down her spear and dropped to her knees with her hands raised. She yielded. In wildling culture, that carried weight. A warrior who yields has the right to expect mercy, or at least a quick death. To kill someone who has yielded is considered cowardly, dishonorable, the act of someone who fears a fair fight. But the Night's Watch did not operate under wildling customs. They had their own rules, their own necessities, and a prisoner this deep in hostile territory was more liability than asset. She could not be brought along, could not be trusted not to escape, could not be released to report their position and numbers. Which left only one option. Qhorin questioned her first. Her name was Ugri. She belonged to a clan that followed Man's Raider. When pressed about what Man sought in the Frostfangs, she claimed ignorance of specifics, but confirmed that something old and powerful drew the king beyond the wall to these mountains. Something he believed could change the balance of power between the free folk and the Watch. She was young, Qhorin noted, perhaps 18 or 19. She had the red hair common among wildlings, worn wild and tangled. Her face bore the weathered look of someone who spent their life outdoors, but her eyes held intelligence. She knew exactly how precarious her situation was. When he was done questioning her, Qhorin made a decision that surprised everyone. He looked at John and told him to take the girl aside and do what needed to be done. Then he and the others would move out, put distance between themselves and this place before other wildlings came looking for their missing scouts. It was a test. Qhorin knew it was a test. John knew it was a test. Even Ygritte probably understood what was happening. The question was whether Ned Stark's son could do what rangers must sometimes do, make the hard choice. Execute a prisoner not out of cruelty but out of necessity. Put the mission and his brothers above his personal feelings about killing an unarmed woman who had surrendered. John led Ygritte away from the others, Ghost padding silently at his side. They disappeared behind an outcrop of rock. The other rangers busied themselves with breaking down the wildling camp, scattering the ashes, removing any evidence that might tell other free folk what had happened here. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. Qhorin began to wonder if John was having trouble with the task. Sometimes the first execution is the hardest, especially when the condemned is young and helpless, and looking at you with human eyes that plead for mercy you cannot afford to give. Then John appeared, alone, without Ygritte, without blood on his blade. He had let her go. The other rangers looked to Qhorin, expecting anger, expecting punishment. The boy had disobeyed a direct order, had compromised their mission, had proven himself unable to make the choices that ranging beyond the wall demanded. But Qhorin did not rage, did not rebuke. He simply asked why. John's answer was honest. At least, he could not kill her. Not like that. Not unarmed and helpless. It went against everything his father had taught him about honor, about justice, about what it meant to be a good man. If that made him unfit to be a ranger, so be it. Qhorin studied him for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable. Then he said something that surprised everyone. If he had wanted the girl dead, he would have killed her himself, or ordered Eben to do it. He had given the choice to Jon specifically because he wanted to know who Jon Snow was, not who he pretended to be, not who he thought he should be, but who he actually was when faced with an impossible decision. Now he knew. Jon Snow would not compromise his honor even when ordered to do so by a superior officer. Even when tactical necessity demanded it, that kind of stubborn adherence to personal morality could get men killed. But it could also mean Jon was the kind of man who could be trusted completely, who would not break under pressure, who would hold to his principles even when those principles cost him dearly. The immediate problem was that Ygritte now knew they were here. She would run back to her people, would report a ranger scouting party in the Skirling Pass. Every wildling for miles would be hunting them, which meant they needed to move fast. They abandoned stealth for speed, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the ambush site. The terrain grew rougher, the paths narrower. They were pushing deeper into the Frostfangs now, into country where few rangers had ever gone. Ghost ranged ahead, but even the direwolf seemed uneasy. The mountains felt wrong somehow, too quiet, too empty, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. On the second day after the encounter with Ygritte, Stone Snake spotted campfires in a valley below them. Not a few, dozens, perhaps hundreds. A massive gathering of free folk, far more than any raiding party. This was an army, or the beginnings of one. Qhorin had found what Mormont sent him to find, proof that Mance Rayder was uniting the clans, proof that the threat was real and imminent. Now they just needed to survive long enough to report it. That night, as they made cold camp in a crevasse that offered some protection from wind and observation, Qhorin pulled Jon aside. He spoke about fire, how beyond the wall, fire was life. It kept you warm, cooked your food, drove back the darkness and the things that moved in darkness. But fire could also be death. Those campfires they had seen in the valley below meant the wildlings felt safe, comfortable, confident. But those fires also announced their presence to anyone watching. Such a small fire, Qhorin said, looking at the darkness around them. Such a small thing to cost a man his life. Jon did not fully understand the lesson yet, but he would, soon enough. He would understand exactly what Qhorin meant. Understand that everything in this frozen hell could save you or kill you, depending on how you used it. Fire, honor, mercy, even love. The wildlings found them the next morning, not Ygritte's people, someone else. A band led by a raider the free folk called Rattleshirt, the Lord of Bones who wore armor made from the remains of his kills. And Rattleshirt was not interested in taking prisoners. Rattleshirt earned his name honestly. He wore pieces of the dead, bones lashed to leather and mail, skulls dangling from his belt. Some said he took trophies from every man he killed. Others claimed the bones were from his own kin, worn to remind him what failure cost. Either way, the sight of him was enough to make even experienced rangers hesitate. He led perhaps 30 wildlings, maybe more, hard to count when they moved through the rocks like water, finding cracks. These were not farmers or herders forced into service. These were fighters, men who lived for the hunt, who measured their worth in kills and plunder. The rangers ran. There was no shame in it. 5 men cannot stand against 30, not in terrain that favored ambush and mobility over formation fighting. Qhorin made the call instantly. Scatter and regroup at a predetermined location 2 miles north, a narrow defile he remembered from previous rangings. If they could reach it, the terrain would force Rattleshirt's numbers into a bottleneck where superior wildling strength meant nothing. But the wildlings were fast, faster than expected. They knew these mountains as well as Qhorin did, perhaps better. They cut off the northern route within the first hour, forcing the rangers to veer east into less familiar territory where every turn could be a dead end. Qhorin's mind worked frantically, recalculating routes, assessing options. They needed to slow the pursuit, give themselves breathing room to find defensible ground or lose their trackers entirely. That meant someone had to stay behind. Someone had to make a stand while the others gained distance. Dalbridge understood without being told. He had always understood. That was why Qhorin valued him, trusted him. The archer moved to a rocky outcrop that overlooked the path they had just traversed. Good sightlines, solid cover. a pile of loose stones he could use as additional protection. He did not ask if this was necessary, did not argue or beg for another option. He simply checked his bowstring, counted his arrows, and settled into position with the calm of a man who had always known how his story would end. Qhorin gripped his shoulder once, a moment of connection between brothers who both understood the price of service. Then the others moved out, leaving Dalbridge alone with his bow and his courage. They were a mile away when they heard it. The distinctive snap and whistle of arrows in flight. Many arrows. Dalbridge was not conserving ammunition. He was making every shot count, forcing the wildlings to take cover, to slow their advance, to pay in blood for every foot of ground. The sounds continued for perhaps 10 minutes. Then they stopped. Silence fell over the mountains, broken only by wind and the crunch of boots on snow. Nobody spoke about what that silence meant. They pushed on through the afternoon, moving as fast as the terrain allowed. John kept glancing back, as if expecting to see Dalbridge jogging to catch up, grinning about the wildlings he had put down. But Ghost knew better. The dire wolf's ears were flat, his body language tense. He understood death when it touched someone in his pack. By evening, they found a defensible position, a shelf of rock with good visibility and limited approaches. They would rest here for a few hours, recover some strength. But Qhorin knew the respite was temporary. Rattleshirt would not stop, could not stop, not if he wanted to maintain his reputation among the free folk. During the watch rotation, Eben pulled Qhorin aside. He had been scouting their back trail, and the news was worse than expected. The wildlings were not just pursuing, they were coordinating. Multiple groups moving to cut off escape routes. Someone among them, probably Rattleshirt himself, understood tactical encirclement. More concerning, Eben had spotted what looked like a larger force to the west, perhaps 100 wildlings or more. If those forces linked up with Rattleshirt, the Rangers would be hopelessly outnumbered. There was only one move that made sense. Someone needed to reach the fist of the first men, carry word to Mormont about the wildling army gathering in the valleys, about the coordinated tactics, about whatever Mons was searching for in these cursed mountains. Eben volunteered immediately. He was the fastest runner among them, could navigate at night better than most men could in daylight. If anyone could slip through the wildling cordon, it was him. Qhorin agreed, but not to save himself or the others. The mission was all that mattered now. If Eben died trying to reach Mormont, at least he would die serving the watch. Better that than all of them perishing here with no one to carry the intelligence they had gathered. They gave Eben the best horse. Not that horses lasted long in this terrain, but it might buy him a few crucial miles before the animal broke a leg or exhausted itself. They equipped him with dried meat and water, stripped away anything that might slow him down or make noise. Then he was gone, vanishing into the darkness like a ghost. The remaining four, Qhorin, Stone Snake, John, and Ghost, moved out before dawn. They stayed in the high places now, using elevation to spot threats before threats spotted them. It was slower going, more exhausting, but it kept them alive. For a while, the wildlings caught up to them on the second day after Eben's departure. Not Rattleshirt this time, but others, a hunting party that should have been easy to avoid, except they had dogs, big shaggy beasts that could follow a scent trail over bare rock. The Rangers killed the dogs first, had to. Then they killed the wildlings, quick and brutal, because any sound would draw more hunters. 6 bodies left cooling in the snow, and the Rangers moved on. But the damage was done. The encounter had cost them time, forced them into terrain they had not scouted, and worse, it had confirmed their position for the enemy. The wildlings knew where they were now, knew they were running, knew they were desperate. That evening, they saw the signal fires, tall pillars of smoke rising from peaks in 3 directions. The wildlings were communicating, coordinating, tightening the noose. Qhorin called a halt in a narrow ravine. They needed to reassess, find a way through the encirclement, or accept that they were trapped and plan accordingly. Stone Snake volunteered to scout ahead. He could climb up to the ridgelines, get a proper view of their situation, see if there was a route that would take them beyond the wildling net. It made tactical sense. Stone Snake was the best climber any of them had ever seen. If there was a path, he would find it. But sending him meant the group split again, down to 3. And if Stone Snake did not return, if he fell or got captured or simply vanished into the mountains as men sometimes did, then it was just Qhorin and Jon. Still, there was no choice. Not really. They needed information to make decisions, and Stone Snake was the only one who could get that information. The little ranger checked his climbing gear, made sure his rope was sound, and his hands free of anything that might slip. Then he began ascending the cliff face, moving with the confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times. They watched him climb until he disappeared over the rim of the ravine. Then they settled in to wait, knowing that waiting in these mountains was its own form of torture. Every sound could be approaching wildlings. Every shift in the wind could carry your scent to hunters. Hours passed. The sun, what little you could see of it through the clouds, tracked across the gray sky. Stone Snake did not return. When darkness fell completely, Qhorin made the decision. They would move without him. Head north by northwest, using the stars when they could see them, dead reckoning when they could not. It was their only option. So now there were 2, a legendary ranger with half a hand and decades of experience, and a bastard boy who had been with the Watch for barely a year, plus 1 white direwolf who moved through the snow like a drift of wind. The wildlings found them the next morning. Not a hunting party this time, not a scouting group. The main force, dozens of them, led by Rattleshirt himself, who looked at the 2 rangers with something approaching respect mixed with anticipation. He had been chasing the Halfhand for days, had lost men to do it, but now the hunt was over. Now came the kill. Except before he could give the order to attack, one of his wildlings, a woman with red hair, stepped forward. Ygritte, the one Jon had spared, she spoke quickly in the wildling tongue, gesturing at Jon, at Ghost, arguing for something. Rattleshirt listened. Then he smiled, and that smile was worse than any threat. He told Jon to yield, lay down his sword, surrender, or watch the Halfhand die slowly, over hours as an example to anyone who thought they could run from the Lord of Bones. Jon looked at Qhorin, waiting for orders, waiting for the command to fight or flee or die with honor. But Qhorin did not give the order Jon expected. Instead, he told Jon to yield, do exactly as Rattleshirt demanded, lay down the sword, surrender. Jon's face showed incomprehension, betrayal. You did not surrender to wildlings. You fought until you could not fight anymore. You died before you broke your vows. That was what rangers did. Except Qhorin's eyes held something else. A message Jon could not quite read. A plan forming in the depths of that tactical mind. Ygritte vouched for Jon, told Rattleshirt that this one had shown mercy, had let her live when he could have killed her. That meant something among the free folk, meant he might be turned, might be convinced to abandon the Watch and join the king beyond the wall. Rattleshirt considered this. Then he made his pronouncement. If Jon wanted to prove his sincerity, he would kill Qhorin Halfhand, here, now, in front of everyone. Kill the legend, kill his commander, kill the man who had brought him into these mountains. Do that, and he could live, refuse, and they both died. The trap was perfect. Either way, Rattleshirt won. Either he got to kill the Halfhand himself, or he got to watch the Halfhand die at the hands of his own man. Either way, the greatest ranger of the Night's Watch would be dead, and his death would break the spirit of the brothers in black. What Rattleshirt did not understand, what he could not understand, was that Qhorin had been planning for this moment, had seen it coming perhaps days ago, had understood that capture was inevitable, and had started constructing a different kind of victory from the materials of defeat. Jon Snow, confused and horrified, was about to receive the final lesson, the one that would define everything that came after. The lesson about what duty truly costs when you strip away all the poetry and songs. Sometimes serving the watch means dying in battle. Sometimes it means something much harder. The night before Rattleshirt found them, Qhorin and Jon sat together in the darkness, backs against stone that still held a ghost of the day's meager warmth. Ghost lay between them, a living blanket of fur and muscle, his presence somehow reassuring despite the hopelessness of their situation. Qhorin had been quiet for hours, working through scenarios in his mind, calculating odds, measuring resources against obstacles, coming to conclusions he did not want to reach, but could not avoid. Finally he spoke. His voice was low, meant for Jon's ears alone. He told Jon to recite the oath. The words every man speaks when he joins the Night's Watch. The promise that binds them until death. Jon's voice was hesitant at first, uncertain why this mattered now, but he spoke the words. Night gathers, and so, my watch begins. It shall not end until my death. I shall take no wife, hold no lands, father no children. I shall wear no crowns, and win no glory. I shall live and die at my post. Qhorin joined him for the last lines, the most important lines. I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the shield that guards the realms of men. I pledge my life and honor to the Night's Watch for this night and all the nights to come. When they finished, silence settled between them. The kind of silence that feels heavy with unspoken truths. Then Qhorin laid it out, not gently. There was no room for gentleness in what he needed to say. They were trapped. Rattleshirt would find them tomorrow, maybe the day after. When he did, they would die. That was certain. The only question was whether their death served any purpose beyond satisfying wildling bloodlust. Jon started to argue. They could fight, could take some of the bastards with them, could die as rangers should, blade in hand. Qhorin cut him off. Fighting would accomplish nothing, except getting them killed slightly faster. But there was another way, a path that might, just might, turn this disaster into something useful. Jon could yield, could pretend to turn his cloak, could infiltrate the wildling army. The suggestion hit Jon like a physical blow. You could see it in his face, even in the darkness. The horror, the rejection, everything he had been taught, everything he believed about honor and oaths and loyalty, rebelled against the idea. Qhorin pressed on. Someone needed to get inside Mance's camp, learn his plans, discover what he sought in these mountains, find out how many warriors he had gathered, what routes he planned to use when he intended to attack the wall. That intelligence could save thousands of lives. But no ranger could simply walk into a wildling camp and expect to be trusted. The free folk were not stupid. They knew deception when they saw it. Unless the deception was sold properly, unless it was made believable through sacrifice. Jon was shaking his head. No, he would not betray his brothers, would not forsake his vows, would not become what he had sworn to fight against. Qhorin's voice hardened. This was not a request. This was an order from a superior officer. Jon had sworn to obey the Night's Watch. Well, the Watch was giving him a mission, the most important mission of his life, and he would damn well carry it out. But Jon was Ned Stark's son, and Ned Stark had raised his children to value honor above all else. Jon would rather die true to his vows than live as an oath-breaker, even if that oath-breaking served a greater purpose. So Qhorin changed tactics. He talked about Ned Stark, about the man Qhorin had known, briefly, years ago. Ned had understood that sometimes honor demanded ugly choices, that protecting your people meant getting your hands dirty in ways songs never mentioned. Jon's father had been a good man, but good men in positions of power learned quickly that moral purity was a luxury. You did what needed doing. You made the hard choices. You carried the weight of those choices for the rest of your life. That was what leadership meant. And Jon, whether he wanted it or not, was being thrust into leadership, not because of his skills or experience, but because circumstances demanded it and no one else could fill the role. Qhorin explained the practicalities. The wildlings had seen Jon spare Ygritte, that act of mercy, that moment of weakness as most rangers would see it, was now their greatest asset. Ygritte would vouch for him, would tell Mance Rayder that this one was different, that he could be turned. And Jon had another advantage, his direwolf. Ghost made him mysterious, touched by old magic. The free folk respected such things. They would be curious about a warg, even a barely trained one who did not yet understand what he was. Most importantly, Jon was Ned Stark's son. Everyone knew the tale: Robert's rebellion, Ned's honor, his reputation for truth and justice. A bastard son of such a man turning his cloak would seem plausible. Southern lords and their rigid honor often pushed their bastards into impossible positions. It was believable that Jon might resent his father, might resent the Watch, might be willing to seek a new life among the free folk. But for any of this to work, Jon's turn had to appear genuine, complete, irreversible. Which meant Qhorin had to die, and Jon had to be the one to kill him. The silence that followed this statement stretched into forever. Jon was crying now, though he tried to hide it. 19 years old and being asked to commit an act that would haunt him until his dying day. Qhorin spoke more gently now. This was his choice, his sacrifice. Jon would simply be the instrument, the blade. Every ranger understood that death was part of the job. The only question was whether your death meant something or vanished like smoke on the wind. This death would mean something, would give the Watch a chance, would honor the men who had already fallen, Galbridge and Eben and probably Stone Snake too. Their deaths would not be for nothing if Jon completed this mission. Jon asked the question that was tearing him apart. How could he live with himself? How could he wear black again after killing a brother? After becoming exactly what the realm called him, a bastard with no honor? Qhorin's answer was simple. You live with it because you must, because the alternative is failing your brothers and your vows. The oath does not promise easy service. It promises service until death, and sometimes service demands things that feel like dying while you still breathe. He reminded Jon of the words they had just spoken. I am the shield that guards the realms of men. A shield does not choose which blows it takes. It does not ask for only the attacks that feel honorable. It stands between danger and those it protects, taking whatever damage comes. Jon would be that shield, would take this blow, would carry this burden, because that is what the Watch demanded of him. They sat in silence for a long time. After that, there was nothing more to say. The plan was laid. The pieces were in position. Now they just had to wait for Rattleshirt to arrive and play his part in a performance he did not know he was staging. As dawn approached, Qhorin told Jon one final thing. When the moment came, Jon must not hesitate, must not pull his strike, must sell it completely. The wildlings needed to believe the kill was real, born of genuine conflict and rage. So Qhorin would provoke him, would insult him, would attack him, and force him to defend himself, would create a situation where killing looked like the only option. And Ghost would help. The direwolf was bonded to Jon, would sense his distress, would intervene to protect him. That intervention would create the opening. The moment when Qhorin's guard dropped and Jon's blade could strike true. Jon asked, voice breaking, if Qhorin was afraid. The Halfhand smiled. It was a sad smile, tired, but also peaceful in a way that suggested he had made his peace with this ending long ago. Every man fears death, he said, but every ranger learns to make that fear serve them rather than control them. He had lived longer than most who took the black, had seen more, done more. If his death brought the Watch even a small advantage in the war to come, that was more than most men could claim. He told Jon to remember that he died a brother of the Night's Watch, that whatever Jon had to do, whatever role he had to play among the wildlings, that core truth remained unchanged. They were both watchers on the wall. They were both shields guarding the realms of men, just in different ways. When Rattleshirt and his wildlings found them the next morning, everything was already decided. The performance had been rehearsed, the roles assigned, the ending written. Now they just had to act it out. Rattleshirt's demand hung in the air like poison. Kill Qhorin Halfhand, or watch him die slowly while you die fast. Prove your sincerity in blood, or prove your loyalty to the Watch and perish for it. To the wildlings watching, this was entertainment, justice. The great Halfhand finally brought low, killed by his own man. They were already savoring it, already imagining the songs that would be sung about this moment. Jon looked at Qhorin, desperate for a sign that this was a mistake, that there was another plan, that his commander would give him an order that did not require him to become a kinslayer and oathbreaker. But Qhorin's face was stone, and then he moved. Not slowly, not with hesitation. The Halfhand attacked Jon Snow with the full fury of a man fighting for his life. His long sword came out fast, too fast for most men to follow. Despite having only 2 fingers on his right hand, despite holding the blade left-handed, he moved with the deadly grace of someone who had spent decades mastering his craft. Jon barely got his own sword up in time. Long Claw rang against Qhorin's blade, the impact sending shock waves up his arms. He stumbled back, off balance, his mind screaming that this was his commander, his teacher, the man who had brought him into these mountains. Qhorin did not give him time to think. He pressed forward, sword moving in patterns Jon had never seen. High slash, low cut, thrust toward the belly. Each strike, precise, economical, the work of a master who wasted no motion. And as he attacked, Qhorin spoke. His words were meant to hurt as much as his blade. He called Jon a bastard, not just stating fact, but making it an insult, throwing it at him like filth. Ned Stark's shame, the evidence of his father's single moment of weakness, a mistake wearing human skin. He asked if Jon thought his father had loved him. If Jon truly believed Ned Stark saw him as a son rather than a reminder of dishonor, why else would Ned have hidden Jon's mother's identity? Why else would he have sent his bastard to the wall to freeze and die forgotten? The words found their marks. Jon had wondered about these things in dark moments, had questioned whether his father's kindness masked deeper rejection, the doubt and pain that every bastard carries. Qhorin was weaponizing it. Jon fought back now with real anger, not fake rage for the wildlings' benefit, but genuine hurt transmuted into violence. His sword met Qhorin's with increasing force. He was younger, stronger, less skilled, yes, but skill mattered less when fury drove the blade. The wildlings watched with growing excitement. This was not an execution. This was a real fight. The boy had teeth after all. Qhorin shifted his approach. He started making mistakes, small ones at first. A parry slightly too slow, a riposte that did not quite connect. Nothing obvious enough to look deliberate, but enough to give Jon opportunities. He continued the verbal assault, called Qhorin's own honor into question, said that Jon would die with black brothers on his lips, pretending oaths meant something. But look where those oaths had brought them. Look what loyalty to the Watch had earned. Death in the snow, forgotten and unmourned. Jon's responses came through gritted teeth. He was not a good enough liar to fake this anger, but he did not need to fake it. The anger was real. Anger at Qhorin for putting him in this position. Anger at himself for agreeing to it. Anger at the Watch for demanding such sacrifice. Anger at the whole bloody world that forced good men into impossible choices. Their swords rang together, again and again. The sound echoed off the mountain walls. Jon was tiring, but so was Qhorin. Or at least Qhorin was making it look like he was tiring. His breathing grew heavier, his strikes less precise. He stumbled once on the uneven ground. Then Ghost intervened. The direwolf had been circling the fight, confused and distressed. His bonded human was in combat with someone who smelled of the pack. Every instinct told him to protect Jon, but also not to attack this man who had traveled with them, who had fed him scraps, who had never shown threat. But when Jon stumbled and Qhorin's sword came down toward his head, Ghost's confusion resolved into clarity. His human was in danger. That was all that mattered. The direwolf lunged, not at Qhorin's throat. Thank the old gods. That would have been too quick, too merciful. Ghost went for the leg instead. His teeth clamped down on Qhorin's calf, right through leather and wool, and bit hard. Qhorin cried out. Genuine pain, because direwolf teeth are not gentle things. He staggered, his weight shifting, his guard dropping. And there it was. The opening. The moment they had both known would come. Jon saw it. Saw the exposed line of Qhorin's throat. Saw how the Halfhand was positioned wrong to defend it. Saw how one thrust, properly angled, would end this nightmare. Their eyes met, just for an instant. And in that instant Qhorin gave the smallest nod. Do it now, for the Watch. Jon lunged. Longclaw, the bastard sword that had been his father's gift, that carried the wolf of House Stark on its pommel, drove forward. The Valyrian steel blade was sharp beyond reason. It met flesh and parted it like water. Qhorin's throat opened. Blood, bright and red and impossibly abundant, poured out. Not the trickle of a minor wound, but the flood of a severed artery. The kind of bleeding that cannot be stopped. That means death is coming, and coming fast. Qhorin dropped his sword. Both hands went to his throat, not trying to staunch the flow because that was impossible, but perhaps simply because that is what hands do when the body realizes it is dying. He fell to his knees in the snow. Blood stained the white, spread out in patterns like some obscene flower. And with the last of his breath, with the last moment of consciousness before the darkness took him, Qhorin Halfhand spoke his final words. We are the Watchers on the Wall. Not a full recitation of the oath, just those words, a reminder, an absolution, a message meant only for Jon.
You are still my brother. You are still a ranger. You are still serving the Watch, even when it looks like betrayal. Remember that. Remember who you are.
Then he fell forward into the snow, the legendary Halfhand, the ranger who survived what killed everyone else. The man who had become more myth than human, dead in a frozen wasteland, killed by a boy he had known for less than a month. Jon stood frozen, his sword still in his hand, blood on the blade, his mind unable to process what he had just done. Ghost whimpered and pressed against his leg, seeking comfort or offering it. The wildlings erupted in noise. Rattleshirt was laughing, a sound with no humor in it. Others were cheering or cursing, depending on whether they had wanted the Halfhand dead or wanted to kill him themselves. Ygritte was watching Jon with something approaching pity. She understood, perhaps better than the others, what this cost. She had seen his face when he spared her. She knew he was not a man who killed easily. Rattleshirt strode forward and kicked Qhorin's body, making sure he was truly dead, savoring the moment. Then he turned to Jon with a grin full of broken teeth. The boy had proven himself, had killed his commander, had chosen life with the free folk over death with the Watch. Now they would take him to Mance Rayder, and the king beyond the wall could decide if this turncloak was worth keeping or worth killing. They dragged Thorin's body to a clear space and built a fire. The wildlings burned their dead, believing that flame freed the spirit to find whatever afterlife waited. It was more respect than most rangers received beyond the wall. Usually, the crows picked your bones and the snows covered the remains until spring. As the fire consumed Qhorin Halfhand, the wildlings divided his possessions. Rattleshirt claimed some of the bones, adding them to his ghastly armor. Ygritte took the cloak, wrapping it around her shoulders despite the blood staining it. Others took his mail, his gloves, his boots, his helm, everything of value, everything that could be used. They left Jon his sword, his own clothes and ghost, because none of them wanted to try taking a dire wolf from its bonded human. Then they bound Jon's hands and started the march toward Mance Rayder's camp, toward the heart of the wildling army, toward the role Qhorin had given him with his dying breath. Jon Snow walked among his enemies, a brother of the Night's Watch pretending to be a betrayer, and he would have to maintain that pretense for as long as it took, days, weeks, maybe months, all while living with the memory of what he had done, the feel of his blade entering flesh, the sound of Qhorin's final words, the knowledge that he had killed a good man, a brother, a legend, for the Watch, for the realms of men, for duty and honor and all the pretty words that seemed so hollow now, covered as they were in blood. The wildling camp sprawled across a valley like a small city made of leather and fur. Hundreds of tents, thousands of people, more free folk gathered in one place than anyone south of the wall had seen in generations. Warriors from every clan, the Thens with their bronze and discipline, the cave dwellers from the Frostfangs, the raiders from the frozen shore, all united under one man's banner. Mance Rayder received Jon in a tent warmed by braziers, surrounded by his chiefs and advisors. The king beyond the wall was not what Jon expected. No crown of bones or savage furs, just a man in his middle years, handsome in a weathered way, with laugh lines around his eyes, and the easy confidence of someone who led not through fear, but through respect earned over decades. When Rattleshirt presented Jon as the ranger who killed Qhorin Halfhand, Mance's expression shifted, became distant, sad in a way that suggested real grief. He told Jon that Qhorin had been his enemy, but also his brother. Once, they had ranged together, fought together, being young and stupid and brave together in the way only brothers of the Watch could be. That bond did not break just because Mance chose freedom over his vows. Then Mance asked the question that had no good answer. Should he thank Jon for killing his enemy, or curse him for killing his friend? Jon's response, when it came, was honest at least. You ought to thank me for killing your enemy, and curse me for killing your friend. Mance smiled at that, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Then he began questioning Jon in earnest, not hostile interrogation, but careful probing, testing, looking for inconsistencies, for signs of deception, because Mance Rayder had not survived as king beyond the wall by being naive about Night's Watch tactics. Jon played his role as Qhorin had instructed. Let the truth show through wherever possible. He was Ned Stark's bastard. He had been treated differently at Winterfell, always the outsider looking in. The Watch had seemed like a brotherhood where birth did not matter, but he found the same prejudices and politics. He had killed a white, yes, but that did not make him special in the eyes of most rangers, just lucky. And Qhorin had given him an impossible choice: kill or be killed, survive or die for oaths that no one south of the wall even remembered anymore. The lies worked because they were wrapped in truth. Jon was angry. He did feel like an outsider. He had killed Qhorin, and that act haunted him in ways Mance could see clearly in his eyes. What Mance could not see was that the haunting came not from regret about betraying the Watch, but from the knowledge that he had killed a good man who asked him to, who died willingly so Jon could complete a mission. That subtle distinction, that microscopic difference in motivation, was all that separated Jon's truth from the lie Mance believed. Over the following weeks, Jon learned what Qhorin had sent him to learn. The wildlings numbered close to 100,000 when you counted warriors, women, children, elderly. Mance was not just raiding, he was evacuating, moving his entire people south because something in the far north terrified them more than the Night's Watch ever could. The others, the White Walkers of legend, they were real, they were waking, and the free folk were fleeing before them, like animals before a forest fire. Mance's search in the Frostfangs had been for the Horn of Winter, the legendary artifact said to bring down the wall with a single blast. He had not found it, or claimed he had not, but Jon could never be certain if that was truth or misdirection. What mattered was the plan. Mance would send climbers over the wall at its weakest points, create breaches, then throw his full force at Castle Black and the other manned castles, overwhelm them through sheer numbers, break through and lead his people south into the lands beyond, where they could scatter and survive whatever came hunting from the frozen wastes. This was the intelligence Qhorin died for. This was what Jon needed to carry back to the Watch. The when, the where, the how of the attack to come. But getting away proved harder than expected. Mance kept Jon close, not out of suspicion necessarily, but because Jon was useful. He could read and write, could explain southern customs and Night's Watch tactics, could help Mance understand the enemy he was preparing to fight. And there was Ygritte, the wildling woman Jon had spared, who had vouched for him, who now claimed him as her prize for bringing him in. She watched him constantly, slept near him, made it clear through action and word that she was judging whether his turn was genuine or performance. Jon walked a razor's edge for months, every day pretending to be something he was not, every night lying awake wondering if tomorrow would be the day someone saw through the deception, wondering if Qhorin's sacrifice would be wasted, because Jon was not good enough actor to pull this off. But in his heart, in that place where truth lived, even when lies covered his mouth, Jon Snow remained exactly what he had sworn to be. A brother of the Night's Watch, a watcher on the wall, a shield guarding the realms of men. When the opportunity finally came, when the wildling army began its march toward the wall and the chaos of movement created gaps in observation, Jon ran. He took Ghost and whatever supplies he could grab, and fled south through the forests, pursued by wildling hunters who wanted him dead for his betrayal. He reached Castle Black days before Mance's forces arrived, carried with him every scrap of intelligence he had gathered. The numbers, the tactics, the timing, everything the Watch needed to mount a defense. At first, his brothers did not believe him. Ser Alisair Thorn and Janus Slint, who had never liked Janna, claimed he was a turncloak, a deserter, a liar feeding them false information to set them up for slaughter. They had heard Rattleshirt's version of events brought by other sources, the tale of Jon Snow begging for his life while Ghost attacked Qhorin and then opening the Halfhand's throat like a coward. It was only when Stannis Baratheon arrived at the wall with his forces, when the king himself interviewed Jon and judged him truthful, that Jon's account gained the credibility it needed. Stannis had a gift for reading men. He believed Jon's story about Qhorin's final orders, about the sacrifice made to plant a spy in Mance's camp. The battle for Castle Black that followed was desperate and bloody. The wildlings threw everything they had at the wall, came in waves that seemed endless, climbed the ice with hooks and rope, attacked the gates with mammoths and giants, fought with the fury of people who had nowhere left to run. But the Watch held, barely, impossibly. They held because they knew what was coming, because Jon's intelligence had allowed them to prepare, to position their meager forces where they would do the most good, to anticipate the wildling tactics and counter them. When Stannis's cavalry hit the wildling army from behind, when the assault finally broke and the free folk retreated or surrendered, the victory belonged to many people, to the rangers who stood their ground, to the builders who maintained the wall, to the king who brought reinforcements at the critical moment. But the foundation of that victory, the information that made it possible, had been purchased with Qhorin Halfhand's life. After the battle, during the election for a new Lord Commander to replace the slain Jorah Mormont, Samwell Tarly worked tirelessly to gather votes for Jon. One of his most effective arguments came when speaking to Setter Dennis Mallister, the commander of the Shadow Tower and Qhorin's direct superior. Sam reminded the old knight that Qhorin Halfhand, the best ranger the Watch had seen in generations, had trusted Jon Snow, had chosen him specifically for his ranging party, had, in the end, given his life to ensure Jon could complete a mission vital to the Watch's survival. If Qhorin's judgment was worth anything, and everyone agreed it was worth everything, then Jon Snow deserved consideration for command. The argument helped sway enough votes. Jon Snow became the 998th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. A bastard boy, barely 20 years old, thrust into leadership of an ancient order that was dying by inches. And in the quiet moments, when the weight of command pressed down like a physical thing, Jon would remember Qhorin's last words. "We are the Watchers on the wall," a reminder that no matter how high you rose or how many men called you Lord Commander, the job remained the same. Stand your ground. Protect those who cannot protect themselves. Serve until death takes you. Jon tried to lead the way Qhorin had taught him. Not through grand speeches or displays of strength, but through understanding, through making the hard choices, through being willing to sacrifice anything, including his honor and his life, if it served the greater good. But the cost of those lessons haunted him. In his dreams, Jon killed Qhorin again and again, felt the blade enter flesh, saw the blood-stained snow, heard those final words that were both condemnation and absolution. The guilt never left, could not leave. It was part of who he had become. A boy who killed his mentor to save his brothers. A commander who understood that sometimes victory looked like defeat and honor demanded acts that seemed like betrayal. At the Shadow Tower, the Rangers told stories about Qhorin Halfhand, about his survival skills, his tactical genius, his unwavering dedication to the Watch. The legend grew with each telling, as legends do, until it was hard to separate the man from the myth. But those who had served with him knew the truth beneath the stories. Qhorin had been human, flawed, capable of doubt and fear, like any man. What made him extraordinary was not that he never felt those things, but that he never let them control him. Never let them stop him from doing what needed to be done. Beyond the wall, among the free folk who survived the battle and scattered back into the wilderness, mothers still told their children about the Halfhand, the ranger who always found you, who never quit, who could not be killed by any ordinary means. They said, if you listened carefully on cold nights, you could hear him moving through the darkness, still ranging, still watching, still protecting the realms of men, even in death. The stories were not true, of course. Qhorin Halfhand was dead, burned by wildlings in the Frostfangs, his ashes scattered by wind, his bones carried off as trophies. Nothing remained but memory. Yet in another sense, the stories were absolutely true, because Qhorin lived on in every decision Jon made as Lord Commander, in every ranger who heard the tale and understood what service really meant, in every brother who stood his watch, knowing that the man beside him might one day ask him to make an impossible choice for an essential reason. The greatest rangers were not the ones who survived longest or killed most enemies. They were the ones who understood that the watch was larger than any individual, that your life belonged not to yourself but to the vow you swore, that sometimes the best way to serve was to die in the right way at the right time. Qhorin Halfhand had made that calculation, had given himself willingly to purchase advantage for his brothers, had died orchestrating his own murder to plant a spy in enemy ranks. And that sacrifice, that final act of service, had helped save the wall, had helped preserve the realm, had bought humanity more time to prepare for the darkness that was coming. In the end, what more could any ranger ask? What greater legacy could any man leave? The snow fell softly on the wall, as it always did, as it always would, covering the world in white, erasing footprints, making everything clean and new. Rangers stood their watches in the cold, eyes scanning the north for threats that might never come or might arrive tomorrow. And somewhere in that endless white expanse, in the frozen reaches beyond the wall where few men dared to travel and fewer returned from, the wind carried the echo of an oath, words spoken by countless men across thousands of years. I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the shield that guards the realms of men. Qhorin Halfhand had lived those words, had died by those words, and in doing so had proven that they were more than poetry, more than empty promises made by desperate men in desperate times. They were truth, the deepest truth, the only truth that mattered when everything else fell away. We are the watchers on the wall, for this night and all the nights to come. The watch continues. It always continues. Because men like Qhorin Halfhand understand that some duties transcend death, some oaths outlast the men who swear them, some sacrifices echo through the ages, giving courage to those who come after. Rest well, Halfhand. Your watch is ended, but what you protected endures, and that is enough. That is everything.